Hello and welcome back to 30 Days to Learn Photoshop. This is day 21, blending modes and blending options. My name's Ben Gribbin, and in today's lesson we're going to understand what each blending mode does, and we're going to look at what blending options are. So let's go ahead and switch over to Photoshop. We shall open it up just like so, and we've pre-prepared a file that shows us what colour modes are. So let's go ahead and open that, and while we do that, let's discuss the difference between blending modes and blending options. Blending modes are completely different to blending options. Blending modes are in essence the way that a colour in a layer interacts with other layers around it, whereas blending options are ways of applying styles and effects and all kinds of different shapes and just different textures and things to a layer or a shape. So we're going to look at blending modes first, and you'll notice pretty much every tool, particularly the brush tools in Photoshop where you're actually applying something, so like things like the brush tool, texture tool, and shapes and layers, they can all have something called mode. Now, this smudge tool obviously don't have too many modes, but the brush tool actually can use any of these different colour modes, and layers can be applied as colour modes as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through, starting from the default, we're going to go through all of these colour modes, and then we'll look finally at blending options. So let's start off then with normal. Now this is the default setting for any tool, any layer in Photoshop, and basically it just means that this layer is going to display as a normal layer. It's not going to have any effects, it's just going to be 100% opacity. It's going to be filled to 100%. It's not going to be see-through. The colours are going to be as the colours will print, or in theory. So that's what normal is, just a normal default setting. It's going to be what you want most of the time. However, let's switch to dissolve now. So let's put this dissolve layer on. See, now we've set our layer to dissolve on this panel. If we were using the brush tool, we would set it to dissolve here. Now dissolve basically applies the colours of this top layer in a kind of noise effect. Now depending on the transparency, because it is based upon the transparency, is the amount of colour that will be added. So basically it dissolves in colour in and out, and if we have it at 100% it's completely solid. If we lower it and lower it and lower it, it allows us to add noise and also transparency, so we could add noisy colour to a layer that's below it. So that's dissolve. Now darken, which you will see here, actually compares the layers below for darker pixels and the layers above for lighter pixels and kind of combines them together. Now because this layer is set to be basically inverted from our original, it's actually lighter. The blacks are like a creamy colour. Let me just put it to normal so you can see. The black colours are white, and the greeny turquoisey colour that we had before, or browny green colour there, has gone to a turquoise colour which is lighter. So when we apply it to be a darker option, it's not doing anything, purely because it's lighter than our layer below. So that's why that's doing that. Then we have multiply. So multiply, let's just make sure we've got multiply on there. Multiply is similar to darkness. It combines the darkness from the lower layer, so we've got all this black, as well as the darkness from the upper layer, and any white areas would actually become transparent. So because we don't have anything around this circle anyway, it's transparent, but if it was white it would be completely see-through, which is darker than this lower colour. That gets applied, but obviously nothing's darker than black, so the black from our original layer actually remains. Then we've got colour burn. So let's turn on our colour burn layer. Colour burn essentially adds the colour from the upper layer and combines it with the lower layer. So it keeps darker areas but adds the colour. So no area on our image actually ever gets lighter when we're using colour burn. And next we have linear burn. So let's turn on our linear burn layer. Linear burn is in essence like multiply, but the results are a lot more intense. So if we just show you multiply has got the darker than the light setting on, but linear burn is essentially a really intense version of that, and because it's quite a dark murky image, it is just black in that case. Next we have lighten. So let's turn on our lighten layer. Lighten just tones up the image, and you can see it's very subtle. It compares the two layers, uses the lighter of the two pixel values. So we set this layer to be a kind of almost black but not quite grey layer. So as you can see, we're toggling that on and off, and the black on our lower layer is just slightly changing to a lighter colour. And using lighten, no part of your image will get any darker. Next we've got screens. Let's turn on our screen layer. Screen actually brightens by lightening the lower layer based upon how light the upper layer is. So in this case we've got a really light colour compared to the darker original layer, so it lightens it up, and you can actually use this to be able to auto correct exposure problems on photographs and things like that. Then we've got colour dodge. That's the next one. This has got the exact same colour applied to it than as the screen layer, and what it does basically is it lightens up the layers, resulting in a lot lighter image here. No part of the image will get darkened, and dodge actually just means to basically lighten, so it's a quite extreme lightening. Linear dodge is very similar to screen, which you can use to auto-correct exposure, but it is a lot more intense. So as you can see there, compared to our screen, so okay, linear dodge is a lot lighter and a lot more contrasty. Overlay actually multiplies the light colours and then screens out the dark colours. So it's just an enhancer really, and you can see here the black pattern here has remained, but it has applied this colour to the lighter areas. Then we've got soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light. Now all the lights are pretty much related. Soft light will actually make sure your darker tones are multiplied, and it screens the lighter tones. So let's turn that on. You can see there it's maintaining some of the pattern, but it's applying this colour to the lighter areas of our pattern. And then hard light is multiplying the dark colours, and it screens out the light colours. Vivid light, let's go on to that one. Vivid light is really intense, and what that does is it dodges or burns the lower layer pixels depending on how bright or dark, or when compared to neutral grey, the upper layer is. And that works on the contrast of the lower layer. So you can see that there, it has completely burnt out areas here and dodged the pattern and lightened it up depending on the tone of the layer we're actually applying. Linear light is pretty much the same as vivid light, but it works on the brightness of the lower layer. So if this image down here was brighter, then it would actually directly affect our linear light. And pin light, very similar to linear light, changes the lower layer's pixels depending on how bright the pixels are in the upper layer. So it kind of acts a bit like multiply when the upper layer's colour is darker than neutral grey, and it acts like screen if the upper layer colours are lighter than neutral grey, which in this case they are because we've got that very bright rainbowy effect. So then we've got difference. Let's turn our difference layer on. Difference reacts to the differences between the upper and lower layer pixels in darkness and lightness. Large differences are lightened in terms of the colour, and small differences actually darken the colour, so you can see that there. Then we've got exclusion, which reacts differently again based upon the differences, and it actually masks the differences between the lower layer and upper layer darkness. So you can see here it's used the darkness and it's actually applied the colouring to the darkness as a kind of mask. Next we've got hue. Hue changes the hue of the lower layer to the hue of the upper layer, but leaves brightness and saturation alone. So if we put that on, it's added this colouring to the layer for us, whereas saturation changes the saturation, as its name suggests, of the lower layer to the hue of the upper layer, but then it leaves brightness well alone. Colour changes the hue and the saturation of the lower layer to that of the hue and saturation of the upper layer, but it doesn't make it any brighter or luminosity. It doesn't change that whatsoever. And then finally, luminosity changes the luminosity of the lower layer to that of the upper layer. So you see here we've got the gradient we've applied, but it actually leaves hue and saturation the same. So that has actually resulted in the colouring being removed from that layer. So that's blending modes then. Quite a lot of them, quite detailed. You're probably best off experimenting with them and playing around and seeing what you can achieve with them. However, we're now going to show you blending options. So let's create a new document, and we're going to just put a random shape into here. Let's find our shape tool. Just put a rounded rectangle in just like that. And you can see that's got a gradient applied. Now we've shown you gradients already and we've shown you shapes. This is kind of a way of combining gradients and styles and all kinds of stuff into one of our shapes. So let's just put it to normal blending mode, and you'll see here we've got this little menu here which you probably haven't seen before on any of our videos. So we're going to show you how we've done this, how we've applied a gradient like this to our shape. If you double click on the layer anywhere, you get this all new menu that you won't have seen called Layer Styles, or in other words blending options. And what these do are directly affect the appearance of our layer. You can do them to layers or shapes or text, and they literally just allow you to apply things like drop shadow. Let's just turn our gradient off so you can see this. You can apply drop shadow, and you can set blending modes of the effects you're applying. So it's important you do understand blending modes because they affect the way things are displayed. You can change the distance, the spread, the size, the angle, the amount of noise. So basically anything you'd want to do for things like that. Then we've got inner shadow, which is essentially the same thing, but it's a way of being able to make your objects appear as though they are embedded or embossed, set back, whatever you want to call it. Again, all the same options. Noise, we can actually set how solid the inner shadow is, the distance, the angle. This option here, global light, is quite important because if you turn that off, we could have a drop shadow on the outside of our image, and we could have an inner shadow on the inner side of our image as though they were coming from different light sources. So sometimes you'd want to do that, and that's how you do that. But if you tick on global light, when you change this angle now, you'll notice all your other styles and effects are actually affected by that. Then we've got outer glow. Outer glow literally just applies a glow along the outer edge of our image. So here we've got a really light green glow. We can do the same. We can do an inner glow, changing the colour simply by clicking on this option here and clicking onto that, and then you can set the size, choke again, so you could have a completely, basically an outline of your image. You can set all the blending modes of your outer glow. You can change the noise, the opacity. You can also set what kind of shape it is, so you can have different shaped inner glows. Then you've got bevel and emboss. Now this is a way of being able to make your objects appear as though they are three-dimensional and have shadows and highlights. So you can set all these different bevel options: embossing, pillow emboss, stroke emboss. But if we just show you how to bevel, we can put it on a hard, chisely sort of appearance, which is almost as though it's being carved from wood or stone. And we can set the size again. We can do soften to just soften it out a little bit at the edges. We can set the direction upwards or downwards. We can change the size and we can soften it out. We can use global light again to give the angle, or we could set our own angle. And this time, depending on where you place this crosshair, is actually where your chisel's going to be. So it's got an angle and a distance sort of setting within this circle. You can set the altitude as well, which is how high the light source is coming from. And again, you can change the shape of the contour itself. You can make sure it's anti-aliased, so it's a little bit smoother. You can set the screen modes. You can set the blending modes of the highlight and shadows, and also you can set the colour of both of these. So if you wanted, you could have a nice light grey in a normal colour, or let's do it to a green colour, sorry. Let's do it something like that. And then change the shadows again to a different colour, set that to normal, and you can see our shadows have changed. We can make that as our default blending or bevel and emboss style. We can add a contour, which again is just more shaping, and we can actually make our own custom shapes using this mapping feature here. And we can add a texture to our bevel and emboss, so you could add a wood, or we could add that pattern. You can literally do pretty much anything you want using this tool, so it's very, very flexible, quite useful. We use it quite a lot. Then you've got satin, which applies a kind of overlay, which is kind of used to make metallic effects. It's usually used in conjunction with something else, and you can see it sort of adds a shadow or some sort of relief to the surface, and we've got all the same options as kind of drop shadow there. Color overlay literally overlays a color onto our layer, and we can set all the different blending modes of it here. We can change the opacity. We've got gradient layer, which is the application of a gradient over our image. We can set this to lighten, overlay, whatever blending mode we want. We can have it interact with the other styles. We can change the gradients just like we change our gradient tool, and we can also do the custom settings, so we can tweak where the gradients happen, where the fades are, whether it's transparent or not. Then we've got pattern overlay, which again is very, very similar, but it just allows you to overlay a pattern. You can scale that up, scale that down, you can align it to your layer, you can snap to the original, you can make that your default. And then finally, stroke is one that you might use quite a bit, because it allows you to add an outline either on the outside or the inside. Again, changing blending modes. You can have this as a color, as a gradient. Let's just change the gradient mode there so you can see it a little bit more. You can have it as reflective gradients. You can change the angle it's coming at, the scale of the gradient. Again, you can make that your default. And then if we were to set the fill of our image and the stroke was on, we'd basically get a see-through image with an outline. And also it's worth noting that when you turn the fill down, it doesn't remove effects. So effects will actually remain regardless of the fill of an object. So this object here hasn't got any fill, but yet we can see it because it's got all of these effects applied. And if you want to quickly toggle effects on or off, just hit that little I button there. If you can't see that, it's under a drop down menu under your shape, and you can actually toggle each image effect on or off. So that's blending options. They are one of my favorite tools in Photoshop because they allow you to get very, very creative with your design. So what we learned in today's lesson? Well, we've looked at what each blending mode does, and we've considered what blending options are. And your task for the lesson is to experiment with blending options, i.e. the shapes, on a shape layer to create effects such as a wood effect or a chrome style. Also, add a layer over the top of a photograph and then fill that layer with the colour and practice using the blending modes. Just play around with the layer and see how it interacts with the photograph below it. Next time on 30 Days to Learn Photoshop, we'll be looking at smart objects. Thanks for listening.